number one slide.
Mhm.
So go ahead and share screen so that we can begin. Okay.
All right. Let me begin by saying good evening and welcome to our virtual event highlighting the granddaughters of the Harlem Renaissance. This is the final program of our three-part series. Tonight, you will have the opportunity to hear from Mrs. Manita Bell. Her presentation will trace the historical roots of intersectionality and focus on the key theme of Black women activists. The personal is political. Mrs. Bell will explore how Black women have applied their intelligence and political will to uplift others from the end of slavery to the present. I thank and commend the chair of this event, Janice Edwards. She has organized and led the March programs. They have been well received by our community. At this time, I welcome our board chair, Mr. Donald Harris Jr. for his remarks.
Good evening, all. And again, my welcome to all of our listeners for this last presentation of the Harlem Renaissance Centennial Celebration. I'm really sorry that this is the last one, so I guess for a while, but my thanks goes out to Dr. Thompson and the entire staff for everything that they have done to put together this presentation. I'm excited. I'm excited. You know, I've had my 2 vaccine shots. It's springtime. Our spring sports, as speaking as a whole high school principal, our spring sports are coming back. We are beginning to move our children back to school full time. And I see a beginning of normalcy coming into our lives. And I hope it just doesn't get thrown any curveballs down the road, but we're still going to be safe. We're still going to social distance. We're still going to wear a mask. And, but I also want to say a very expressive thank you to Janice Edwards, my old friend, for putting together this wonderful presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Janice and say again, thank you.
Janice, you're muted.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Monita K. Bell, who serves as the managing editor for the Learning for Justice, which is formerly known as Teaching for Tolerance, a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. LJF is dedicated to helping teachers in school educate young people to be active participants in our diverse democracy through free resources and low-cost professional development resources, all through anti-bias and social justice lens. She leads the team responsible for projects, marketing initiatives, social media content, newsletter, and award-winning magazine, which reaches nearly 500,000 educators each issue. During her time at LJF, she has coordinated the national Mix It Up at lunch day programs and hosted the digital literacy podcast, The Mind Online. Her feature is on the background of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, received second place in the 2017 Green Eyeshade Awards for general news writing in magazines. An Alabama native, she earned a BA in English from Alabama State University and an MA in English from Auburn University. War Eagle. Before joining LFJ, she taught composition and literature courses at both Auburn and Alabama State. She also works as an online writing tutor. Ms. Bell has also written her book, Getting Here Fixed, Black Power, Trans Valuation, and Hair Politics. Please, let's welcome Miss Monisha K. Bell. Monita K. Bell.
Hi, thank you so much, Janice, and thank you for the invitation. Janice found me on LinkedIn to be with you here today, and I'm very excited. I'm Monita Bell. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'll just add to that introduction my personal connection to the topic I'm going to share with you. For as long as I can remember, since I started having to write papers for school, Black women's concerns, especially the ways in which they engage academically with those concerns, has always been a passion for me. And so I'm really excited to share some of that with you here today, and to take, in some ways, what has become a buzzword, intersectionality, and do a little bit of tracing it back through history. So that's what we're going to do. So often in our society, which has patriarchal roots and sexist roots, as well as racist roots, when we think about the folks who have contributed to our history, who have produced knowledge, who have been considered creators of knowledge, for the most part, we're talking about men. For the most part, we're talking about white men. And even in spaces in which you had the growth of race men and race women, that work was so often viewed to be men's work. And so I want to just flip that. I want us to look at the ways in which Black women played key roles in uplifting the race through their intellectual and political work. And we're doing that through looking at the ways they did that with intersectionality before that term was even a term. So I am departing from the theme a little bit. We're not focused on the Harlem Renaissance, but when we look at the intellectual activity that happened during that period, I think we can most certainly look at the ways in which the women like Anna Julia Cooper, who were writing and thinking about intersectionality in the 1890s, most certainly would have had to inform some of that activity in the Harlem Renaissance. And then looking at the granddaughters of the Harlem Renaissance, the women like Polly Murray and Kimberly Crenshaw, and those of us here today who most certainly benefited from that legacy. So that's what we're doing. We're looking at Black women who made their personal political to uplift our people and who share their identities. So first, we're going to talk a little about intersectionality. Since that's the term we're talking about, just make sure we're all on the same level about what intersectionality is. And so we'll have a brief video and then we'll come back.
Intersectionality. Have you heard this word before? Even if you have, you might not know what it means. Let's take a look at it. The first part's easy enough. Intersection, a place where things come together. Intersectionality refers to the reality that we all have multiple identities that intersect to make us who we are. It also gives us a way to talk about oppressions and privileges that overlap and reinforce each other. This term dates back to the 1980s and legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. She noticed that we didn't have an effective way to talk about how the experiences of Black women are different from the experiences of Black men and of white women. How? Black women endure both gender discrimination and racial discrimination. Over the last 30 years, scholars, educators, and activists have expanded the use of the word intersectionality to talk about identities beyond race and gender. Let's look at a few examples. Jerry has a disability and his family lives below the poverty line. He is the oldest of 10, which requires him to do a lot of caregiving and sometimes keeps him out of school. No one in the school counseling office has talked to Jerry or his parents about his plans for after graduation. He has applied for several jobs, but never gets called back. Fatima is Muslim and recently came to the United States from Somalia. She finds that many people at her school make assumptions about her values and abilities before they speak to her. Many of her classmates think she shouldn't be at their school at all. Greta comes from an affluent family. Both her parents and grandparents went to college, and her father owns a successful business. She doesn't think about her identity very often, but she does think of herself as someone who will go to college and get a good job once she graduates. Think about Greta's situation as opposed to Fatima's or Jerry's. Fatima and Jerry are members of marginalized groups. They don't get to choose whether or not to think about their identities. Greta, on the other hand, can ignore intersectionality if she wants to. Life isn't the same for everyone, even for people who share identity characteristics. By adopting an intersectional lens, we have a better opportunity to understand why and to change the institutions that help and harm us based on who we are. Want to learn more? Read our story, Teaching at the Intersections, in the summer 2016 issue of Teaching Tolerance magazine.
Okay, so that video, as was stated at the end, was meant to accompany this story that I wrote called Teaching at the Intersections. And it is applied a little more broadly. It was meant to, that video in particular was meant to be used with students to introduce what that term means. But if we go back to where that term was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, we really are talking about, in the eyes of the law, the ways in which Black women's identities were not considered in legal matters. And this was done in Crenshaw's groundbreaking essay, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist policies. In this piece, she looks at 3 different older legal cases in which Black women, because they were not recognized for both their sex and their race, ended up being the beneficiaries of discrimination that compounded those identities. And so when we talk about intersectionality, we're talking about not only the ways those identities intersect, but also the ways that those intersections can compound oppressions. So just a word about Kimberly Crenshaw and everyone I'm going to talk about. If you don't know much about them, I do encourage you to look them up. Just super brilliant, accomplished women. Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar, a lawyer, she's a civil rights advocate, and a law professor. She teaches full-time at both Columbia and UCLA Law. She's a busy woman. She's a highly sought after speaker and panelist. She's done a TED Talk. And so she is credited with developing this term. And I got to speak with her directly for the story that that video accompanies, Teaching at the Intersections. And so if we go to the next slide, here's how she described intersectionality to me. She said it's a framework to trace the impact of racism, of sexism, of other modes of discrimination, where they come together and create unique circumstances, obstacles, barriers for people who are subject to all of those things. And so we saw that illustrated in the video. Now, just to talk about one of the cases she writes about in that 1989 essay, this is DeGraff and Reed v. General Motors. This was 1976. What happened was General Motors started laying people off, and they did it in order of seniority, or basically the least senior people employed were the ones who got laid off first. But here's the thing, because of racism and because of sexism, Black women ended up being the ones who lost their jobs. And that's because, first of all, Black people couldn't be hired for such, a period of time. When Black people were hired, it was Black men first. There was a whole period of time when women couldn't be employed there. When women were employed, it was white women first. So you have a situation where Black women come at that intersection. They weren't Black men, they weren't white women. So that's where their specific discrimination met the road, so to speak, where the rubber meets the road. Now, if we go to the next slide, this is where we really get to that need for an intersectional lens. Now, the court that made this decision, they decided that these Black women plaintiffs didn't have a claim. They did not find in their favor because, quote, they shouldn't be allowed to combine statutory remedies. So these groups for which civil rights laws had already been created, they were saying it's not fair for Black women to put those things together. So they can't say, I'm Black and I'm a woman. They're saying basically you had to pick one. And doing so would would create a super remedy or give them a super advantage. And so we see here, there's the decision was the lawsuit must be examined to see if it states a cause of action for race discrimination, sex discrimination, or alternatively either, but not a combination of both. And so that kind of thinking at the time did not account for the ways that Black women, as they existed, just having the identities they were born with, needed to have a different consideration. And so Kimberly Crenshaw really helped put a name to that from a legal perspective. And she argued that the court's failure to see the ways in which race and sex compounded the injustice against the plaintiffs indicated a systemic failure. And we know that it's not just limited to Black women. And that's where that video kind of gets into some of the other intersections that can be at play. So you layer in race, you layer in gender, you layer in disability, you layer in nationality or sexual orientation. All of these things, when they come together, create these unique situations for certain people. And Kimberly Crenshaw kind of gave us that name. And ever since then, we know there are still issues, whether it's in school or other legal situations where that intersectional lens needs to be applied, but now we have a term for it. So 1989 and since, that's Kimberly Crenshaw giving us language for it. But if we move back in time, a little bit farther back, next slide, let's talk about Dr. Polly Murray. Again, please look her up. She was phenomenal. She accomplished so many things. She was a poet. She was a writer of fiction and nonfiction. She was a civil rights lawyer, a feminist activist, a labor organizer. She worked with NAACP and all these other organizations. She was a priest. She was amazing. Many more people need to know her name. But another important thing she did in the 1940s and the 50s and the 60s was talk about the unique ways that women, Black people, Black women in various intersections were affected by the, I was going to say the discriminations of the day. I think that's a good way to put it. And one of these things she talked about was Jane Crow. We'll talk about that shortly. But just to learn a little bit about Polly Murray, I'm just going to give you a few tidbits. She was a co-founder of the Congress of Racial Equality and the National Organization for Women. She's got a bachelor's degree from Hunter College, a law degree from Howard, a master's in law from the University of California Law School, and a doctorate in law from Yale. If we go to the next slide, we'll look at some of these accomplishments. I mentioned the co-founding. She's got all these degrees. She was the first in her class at Howard and the only woman in her class. She was the first Black person to earn a doctorate in law from Yale. Next, she was the first Black woman Episcopal priest. That was 1977 when she was ordained a priest. She was appointed to John F. Kennedy's Committee on Civil and Political Rights, which is part of his presidential commission on the status of women. And finally, Thurgood Marshall called her 1951 book, States, Laws on Race and Color, a Bible for civil rights litigators. And so she did a ton. She did a ton. And if I can just get a little bit of interaction in the chat here, I want to know how many of you saw the feature film about Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the basis of sex? You could just drop a yes in the chat. It came out 2-3 years ago. Anybody? Okay, well, I don't see anything in the chat.
We may have to get some information for folks.
Okay, well, if you see On the Basis of Sex, it is a theatrical film. Okay, you know about it. It's a theatrical film about not Ruth Bader Ginsburg's whole life, but really how she kind of entered the legal sphere. There's one scene in which she is preparing for the first case she ever argues in a court, because she had been a legal professor, a law professor, before actually litigating and arguing in courtrooms. They do a moot court at her house, and Polly Murray, a character who plays Polly Murray, is one of the people who prepares her for this case. Because Polly Murray was key in looking at actual gender discrimination before it was a thing, before people were calling it that and saying it was an issue. Polly Murray, with her legal prowess, was making that known, and that's why they had her in the room. So it's just a very quick blip. But looking at that, if we go to the next slide, Polly Murray was the first lawyer, period, to argue that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment should apply to gender discrimination, not Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So many people kind of credit RBG with doing this groundbreaking work on gender discrimination. And that's not to take away from her work at all. But we need to know that she learned a lot of what she got from Polly Murray. So this is the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Again, because we live in a society that is rooted in racism and sexism, you have all these arguments that had to be made about all the people that should apply to, right? Because people just couldn't conceive otherwise. So Polly Murray did that. And she fought racism and sexism on a number of fronts. When we think about her personal life, before she went to Howard Law, she applied to all these other schools and didn't let her in because, segregation and racism. She tried to gain entry into University of North Carolina. She tried to get into Harvard. They wouldn't let her in. But that sexism too, and this is where we start to see those intersections. When she was at Howard, a historically Black university, in their law school, she saw that sexism. She got that different treatment of them not even wanting to let her into the classroom. She couldn't use all the same facilities as her male cohort. And it was that time at Howard where she put a name to that combination, Jane Crow. We know Jim Crow is about racial discrimination. And she found a way to add in that sexism with Jane Crow. That's intersectionality. That's intersectionality, we're talking almost 50 years before Kimberly Crenshaw put a name to it, looking at the ways those two things came together. She was constantly naming racism and sexism and fighting it, even when she was working in social justice spaces. And so, for example, through the NAACP and other organizations she worked in, she did work with Martin Luther King. She did work with Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph in the 60s. In fact, she wrote a letter, a 1963 letter to Randolph saying that she was, quote, increasingly perturbed over the blatant disparity between the major role which Negro women have played and are playing in the crucial grassroots levels of our struggle, and the minor role of leadership they have been assigned in the national policy-making decisions. So even in a progressive movement, even in a Black-centered movement to lift up Black people as a whole and get those equal rights that we're entitled to, we still see the ways in which patriarchy was playing out, and sexism when it came to who got to make decisions, who got to be in the room, who got to call shots. And so she was voicing those intersections in various spaces. I mentioned that she co-founded the National Organization for Women, Betty Friedan, a whole bunch of other well-known people who started this groundbreaking organization to lift up women's rights. But she stepped back from her leadership role in the organization because of their lack of engagement with Black women's issues and issues of social class. And so throughout her life, professional, academic, social justice activist, she's constantly having to name the ways in which Black women are being ignored, even in these progressive spaces. Now, I do want to say something about the pronouns I've been using for Dr. Murray. I've been using she, her pronouns. And it's really important to note that throughout her life, I shouldn't say, well, yeah, she struggled with her gender identity. There were times in her life when she identified more as a man. There were times when she identified more as a woman. She changed her birth name from Anna Pauline to Polly. She kept her hair cut short. There were times when she dressed more, how people would perceive a man to dress, and that was part of her gender expression. There were times in her life when she was trying to get hormone therapy. And this was in like the 30s, 40s, 50s, back before people were really talking openly about that. I want to name that the Pauli Murray Center for Social Justice, they use different pronouns when referring to different parts of her life. And if we go to the next slide, I want to look at this quote from Dr. Brittany Cooper's wonderful book called Beyond Respectability. I highly recommend it. She names the importance of these intersections. So not even the intersections just of race and gender, but also gender identity, and how all of this came to bear in Pauli Murray's life. So at exactly the same moment that she named Jane Crow as a form of sexist discrimination that she experienced as a woman, she was frequently being hospitalized for depression related to her struggle with her gender identity. She always restricted a strict feminine gender performance, but she did come to identify as a woman. And I'll interrupt here to say that we see that in her co-founding of NOW, the National Organization for Women, and the other advocacy she did on behalf of women. In this way, her strategies of negotiation and survival constitute a form of disidentification with the dominant gender norm she encountered during the 30s and 40s. So I just wanted to name that because I cannot talk about the importance of seeing intersectional identities without naming all the identities that she herself was facing. And that's important. We have to keep that in play because that is also going to be another layer of oppression that she experienced in her life. So it's key to name those intersections, and this particular intersection as part of Murray's life. And in spite of all that, the groundbreaking work that she did on so many fronts, and we owe her a lot. So let me go to the next slide then. We're going to go even further back in time to Dr. Anna Julia Haywood Cooper, I should say. I left the Haywood out. She's most frequently known as Anna Julia Cooper. She was amazing. She was just simply amazing. Born in 1858, and I really want to name that she was born almost exactly 100 years before Kimberly Crenshaw, who was born in 1959, and was doing her foundational work, again, about 100 years before Kimberly Crenshaw was naming intersectionality. And so that's why I really want to, trace these legacies of Black women's intersectional work, intellectual and intersectional work, because we see where the foundation was laid, right? This stuff didn't come out of thin air. So if we go to the next slide, and I would love to see a little bit of participation in the chat here. If you think about Black women who are, fresh out of slavery era, so we're talking 1860s, late 1860s into the 1870s. What do you think were their educational and career options during that period? Just drop in some thoughts. What were their educational and career options and opportunities in that era? Maid, housekeeping, right? Okay, so we're thinking domestic, right? And that we know how many decades that lasted, right? Okay, schools, maybe nurses, farm work. So yeah, some of this is also location dependent, right? Okay, exactly. So we're seeing limited education, all different types of domestic work, maybe farm work or sharecropping. We know so many people, even after emancipation, stayed on the farms where their families were enslaved because, again, the options were few. And obviously they didn't have the resources to pick up and leave all the time and start afresh. So yeah, all that makes sense. That's what we'd be thinking. I would also say in terms of schools, and I want to give a shout out to HBCUs because HBCUs were birthed during this era, immediately post-slavery. I'm a graduate of Alabama State University, proud HBCU, founded in 1867. So many HBCUs were founded in the 1860s and 1870s into the late 1800s. And they were founded as normal schools to create teachers who could teach more Black people, because we know education was kept from us by law and otherwise, because we know the power of education. Now, the interesting thing, oh, and because of that, Black people were hungry for education when they could get it, right? And this absolutely includes Anna Julia Cooper. In 1868, so when she's about 10 years old, she received a scholarship to attend a new school in Raleigh, North Carolina, where she's from, dedicated to educating formerly enslaved Black people and their families, and to create more teachers. This was the St. Augustine's Normal School and Collegiate Institute. She attended the school for 14 years. Now, as you might expect for this period, again, because sexism, all the girls who attended this school were supposed to receive the ladies' course. And then, of course, there was a separate men's course, and the men's course was more academically rigorous. It prepared boys for post-secondary education and to have careers. And you might assume then the ladies' course was meant to prepare women to be leaders in the household. All the domestic arts, as we might call them, also some of the classics, but yeah, not academically rigorous, not meant to expand the mind in a scholarly way. But Anna Julia Cooper was not here for any of that. So if we go to the next slide, we'll just look at, again, just a few of her accomplishments. And I really encourage you to look into her work because she was amazing. So at the St. Augustine's Normal School, she argued that she should be able to pursue the men's course because she was capable of doing it. She proved that she was academically on par with all the boys, if not surpassing it. She excelled in all her foreign languages and math and other subjects. And so she successfully argued that she should be able to do the men's course, and she did. She was one of the first 2 Black women ever to earn master's degrees in the United States. And she did that in math in 1888. The other was her Oberlin College classmate, Mary Church Terrell. I absolutely encourage you to look up Mary Church Terrell. She was key in a lot of this work. Yes, absolutely, a Renaissance woman. These women were amazing. They ran in a lot of the same circles and they helped change history together. Go to the next. She was the 4th Black woman ever to earn a doctoral degree. She got her PhD in history at the Sorbonne in Paris. And we're talking late 1800s, like this is wild, right? And then she co-founded the Colored Women's League, which eventually became the National Association of Colored Women. And I should mention these leagues. This is really important to the time period for Black women who were able to become well-educated, because we know there were a whole bunch of barriers in place keeping not just Black women, but people of color, period, from being educated. But for the ones who were able to become well-educated, they would form these clubs or leagues. And from the outside looking in, they just looked like social organizations, women who got together and, had teas and like little sandwiches and would just talk and plan social events. But what Black women were doing, like the Black women in the Colored Women's League, was they were using those spaces and their abilities to be educated and to come together to figure out how can we as women do our part to uplift our people and help get us our rights that we deserve. So it wasn't these petty little frivolous gatherings that men often thought they were. They were doing serious work. And that goes back to the idea of making the personal political, because it wasn't just about domestic spaces. It was about the people. How can we lift up our people? And they use those spaces and their opportunities to do that. And I mentioned the term race men and race women earlier. So when we think about race men, so men during this period, late 1800s into the early 1900s, we think about these men who are using their intellect and their education to lift up the people. So we think of folks like W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Alexander Crummell, many, many others. Frederick Douglass, a huge one. He was absolutely a celebrity in his lifetime. All these men who were lifting up the race. That's kind of what people thought about race men. They weren't thinking so much about race women, of which Anna Julia Cooper was absolutely one. And so was Mary Church Terrell and all these other women who were doing fantastic work. So women were relegated either to domestic concerns or considered like organizers. So yeah, they're going to be the organizers at church. They're going to be the ones putting things together, organizing things at the schools, but they weren't perceived, again, as doing that key foundational intellectual and political work to get people free. And Anna Julia Cooper and so many others who were with her, they were flipping that and saying, no, 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 we have key work to do here to change things for the better. So if we go to the next slide, I haven't said Ida B. Wells yet. Hello, Ida B. Wells, absolutely a race woman and was in these circles during this same time period. So Anna Julia Cooper, she said that, no, we're not just doing traditional women's work. And the traditional women's spaces we operate in are not insignificant. Just because they're domestic does not make them necessary. They're necessary because what we do here is necessary. So these leagues and clubs, they were organizing. These were spaces for grassroots organizing. And what they were saying was basically all of us aren't going to be free until Black women are free. So A Voice from the South by a Black woman from the South is Anna Julia Cooper's foundational book, published in 1892. People still refer to it. And I'll give you a little bit of kind of tracing where we see that influence. She said, only the Black woman, and she put that in all caps, can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me. So it wasn't just the men. It wasn't the men who could say this, because the men did not also face sex discrimination. It was Black women who had to contend with sex and race discrimination, who, if they get free, everybody's free. And that's a refrain we still hear to this day. If any of you are familiar with the Combahee River Collective, and I hope you will, if you're not, please absolutely look into it. And if you recognize the name Combahee River, that is the river on which Harriet Tubman planned her famous raid, the first Black woman to lead a military expedition. They named it after that, because that Black woman who took charge and tried to get her people free, and did free so many of her people. This is what the Combahee River Collective statement says in 1977. By the way, this is a group of Black women, many of them intellectuals who had met in various academic spaces, doing, again, work in the legacy of these race women of the 1890s and early 1900s. They got together to figure out how to get us free. This is a quote from their statement. If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. And we still hear this today. When Black women and girls are free, everybody gets lifted up. And this is what Cooper was talking about. Even as a suffragist, because she was a suffragette, when she said to her fellow white suffragettes in the early 1900s, who were ignoring Black women's issues, quote, "Is not woman's cause broader and deeper and grander than a blue stocking debate or an aristocratic pink tea?" Those white women were focused on, in many ways, these more domestic concerns. We know white women were out there laying it on the line too to get the vote. But again, they were also ignoring the racism of their Black sisters, and in many cases, dishing it out, the racism. And so just as Pauli Murray did when she was engaging with A. Philip Randolph about the sexism she noted in the Black movement for liberation, we have Anna Julia Cooper all these years earlier saying to white fellow suffragettes, oh, I see some links dropping in. Yes, the Combahee River Statement, thank you. What she's saying to her fellow white suffragettes is, okay, we we women aren't going to be free if you're leaving your Black women behind. Some of the same things happening. Women throughout history having to name the ways in which their experiences differ both from Black men and from white women, and the need for that work to be collective to get everybody free. And so again, this is happening way back in the 1890s and early 1900s, post-slavery, right? So as we look at this whole trajectory, going to the next slide, we've got the work then of Anna Julia Cooper. And that's a picture of her when she got her PhD, being fabulous, way back, who was born into slavery, to Pauli Murray in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, all the way then to Kimberly Crenshaw from the 1980s to the present. Black women who use their education, who use their political will, who use their smarts to say, if we're going to get us all free, then we have to name all the ways in which we are not free. And we can't do that by ignoring parts of our identities. The ways that society acts on us in our embodied selves necessarily affects everybody else. And so when you hear that term, intersectionality, from now on, I hope you'll have a greater sense of the overall history that led up to it. And it's a deep, rich history. So this is just 3 women. I mentioned some other names. We know, I think Ida B. Wells, we hear her name a lot. I mentioned Mary Church Terrell. Look into these women, these club women in the 1890s and early 1900s, because they really are the ones who set us on this path. These women who were like Zora Neale Hurston and others in the Harlem Renaissance. And then we've got Pauli Murray and Kimberly Crenshaw, who are the granddaughters of these women. They're also the granddaughters and great-granddaughters of Anna Julia Cooper, Mary Church Terrell, and Ida B. Wells, and really made that thinking about our liberation possible in the ways that we frame it today. So with that, do we have any questions?
At this time, we will offer our participants an opportunity to put questions in the chat. I will stop sharing my screen so that you guys can get a full view. No questions for our speaker? Well, until folks start populating the chat, can you tell us a little bit about your journey? And that's one of the things that we're trying to talk to our speakers about, looking at your journey from where you began to how you got into your space and some of the challenges that you face, sort of being a woman, being a first within your career, or you're moving towards your trajectory to where you are now. What were some of those challenges or hurdles, and how you sort of overcome those hurdles?
Yeah, so I think a lot of those challenges kind of started early in my life. By the way, I'm one of 4 children in my family. I'm a twin. My twin and I are the 2 youngest. And you know, we struggled. we were on food stamps for a while, primarily growing up with my father. My parents were divorced. I remember eating ham sandwiches for dinner, or like ramen noodles, but we made it through. And I'm so thankful for my father in particular, who really drove home the importance of education. So I worked my behind off in school. And I think it was really pursuing that track. And I think about these women we were just talking about, the value of education, really having a hunger for it, where I got full scholarship to school, to Alabama State. You know, no student loan debt, especially being one of 2, a twin going to college at the same time. Like, my dad could not have done that. So I think about the ways that education really did unlock a door for me. And I know it's not that simple, especially today, because there are so many barriers that really get in the way for a lot of people. But all that to say, I would say, especially attending an HBCU, that's where I really started writing about my identity and how I saw it playing out in what I was seeing and reading. Janice mentioned my book earlier, which is my master's thesis that got published as a book, thinking about my hair and my the context around my hair, the way people react to our hair, the lawsuits that have risen over our hair, you know, the legal battles we've had to fight just to wear our hair the way it grows out of our heads. That really informed a lot of my research and my interests. And so I would say in terms of getting to where I am with Learning for Justice, that came through my writing and editing about the issues that matter to me. And that's how I was able to translate that into that work. So we create resources for educators, for K through 12 educators primarily. I never taught K-12. I taught at the college level. I taught English, but I was still able to parlay the teaching I was doing and the ways that I was trying to get beyond the canon in what I was supposed to be teaching, as well as my own personal experience. I translated that into the editorial I have with Learning for Justice and the stories that I seek out and want to make sure we lift up. And I will say in Learning for Justice, which I joined in 2013, so it'll be 8 years this August, one thing I really wanted to do, knowing that the teaching force is primarily white, you know, I think somewhere around 80% white women, with a national platform, really uplift more stories from educators of color, whether it's through the writing or through the stories or the voices that we choose to uplift. So yeah, I think that's kind of a circuitous route to answer that question, Janisa. And
Right.
Sorry, Janice. And I'm looking at the chat.
Yeah, I was about to address some of those questions. So Ms. Bolton she missed your introduction. If you could talk a little bit about your intro, and then we'll move on to the question of looking at women in color and how you navigated those spaces and strategies for the women on the line. And again, this is being recorded, so we will be broadcasting this out to our Bloomfield Public Schools family. So for any of our young girls that are seeing this. So again, briefly about you, so that we could do some catching up and then looking at how being a woman and a woman of color navigating those spaces.
I will say Janice gave the main introduction of me. I kind of jumped right in, but I will say, well, I think I just I gave a little bit of that background as well. But my role is managing editor for Learning for Justice, which is a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Our main office is in Montgomery, Alabama. I'm coming to you from Opelika, Alabama, which is about an hour away. That's where I live. And so, yeah, we provide free and low-cost resources to K-12 educators from an anti-bias and social justice lens. That is, we have a self-titled magazine that is one of the big chunks of my responsibility in terms of producing. We also have professional learning opportunities. That's through webinars, as well as after the pandemic, we'll go back to being in person, but for now, virtual professional learning from our team of trainers. We have classroom resources. We have like just a whole bunch of stuff. Sometimes it can be really overwhelming, but we have a ton of resources for K-12 educators. And we are just, you know, we try to be here in the ways that educators need in some really rough times, and also naming the things that often don't get named when we're talking about education in general, because we know that we have to take into account the fact that the majority of our students are children of color. And so when decisions get made about them that don't take that into account, that don't take into account their intersectional identities, then we know it's the kids who get, you know, left in the middle and left behind, quite frankly. So I see a question here about navigating the space. I think that means navigating my space as an editor. I'm not quite sure. I don't know if anyone wants to clarify the question.
So basically the question is looking at being, like I said, being a woman of color, and how did you sort of make it to where you are, looking at those hurdles, and then as you answer, bring in that point of the critical race theory. So soon to be Dr. McCann is doing her PhD on looking at current research for intersectionality and the Black feminist movement. And so how does the critical race theory fit within your journey as a woman and a woman of color? That's right. We do very thoughtful. These are these level 4 questions. Dr. Bailey's on the call.
I will say that I don't think I have necessarily had a typical experience. I was in a small English department at Auburn University getting my master's. And it was still predominantly white, but I also had a lot of support. For example, if any of you are familiar with the Crunk Feminist Collective, of which Dr. Brittany Cooper is a member, one of the founders of the Crunk Feminist Collective was on my thesis committee. So I feel like I had a lot of support to pursue the things I was interested in pursuing academically. I even got to take a course that was rooted on the literature of the Black Power movement. And that really informed a lot of my thinking. That actually inspired a lot of my thesis about transvaluation and self-determination and how that relates to how we wear our hair. So I don't think my journey has been typical. I would also say I work in a social justice organization, which of course is not exempt from white supremacy. We have had to actually deal quite directly with it in the last couple of years. I won't go into it. It was national news a couple of years ago when we kind of had some huge turnover from the highest levels. And a lot of that had to do with racism, sexism, and white supremacy. So I won't say I'm exempt. However, on the Learning for Justice team, I think we do a good job of practicing what we preach. And so I don't feel that I have had necessarily to fight in the ways a lot of women have had to fight for my place. I've always been confident in talking about what I talk about and knowing what I talk about. And I have had the privilege of having that respected. And I know that's not typical. So I'm sorry I can't answer as, eloquently about strategies or, things I've had to overcome in that respect. I will say, I can think of a couple of times when, maybe with a former boss in that position, having to speak up when I felt that I was being belittled or kind of discounted. And we had that conversation. So what I have definitely tried to do was, and I've had to learn this too, is be a good colleague and a good ally for other people who have not had it as smoothly as I've had it. Because I know that the world does not operate the way my social justice bubble operates with people who are a lot more thoughtful about my identities and the fact that I deserve to be heard. That's not the way the world works.
So that's perfect. And to transition to another question that we have. So it says, how do we bring a fuller understanding of gender freedom with our community's traditional expectations of power and family systems? So again, we have an idea of what this thing is supposed to look like. So how do we move from there?
I just want to make sure, by gender freedom, are we talking about like gender fluidity? I'm thinking about Pauli Murray, so that maybe that's not the way I should go. Okay, you say yes. Okay. So it's 2021. I think, fortunately, we are in an age when there's a lot more information out there. And I think these stories too, understanding, I think a lot of people think the idea of gender fluidity is new and that it's becoming mainstream, when in fact it's not new. And the fact that Pauli Murray was grappling with this in 1933, it's a lot older than that too. There's also been research on this that, yes, there were even enslaved Black people on plantations who had same gender loving relationships. And people don't like to think about that because it's uncomfortable. I think people also, so many Black communities are rooted in traditional Christian backgrounds, but that doesn't mean we can ignore the fact that people with different gender identities or non-binary identities don't exist. They do exist and have always existed. In terms of what we can do, it's really education. We have to have these conversations. So many people in our community would just want to shut it down, like, no, we're not going to talk about that. But I think even, I don't know how many of you have kept up with Lil Nas X, the video he just came out with. It's got a lot of people bothered. It's not new. It's not new. I think we have to have these conversations. And when we talk about education, educators have to be willing to, when we talk about history and people who have made history and influenced history, we can't just talk about straight cisgender people. We have to talk about the queer people who have also shaped our history, of which there are many. Pauli Murray is one. Baird Rustin is another. Lorraine Hansberry is another. We will name folks and what they contributed without naming those aspects of their identity. And if we're going to be real about pride in ourselves, if we're going to be real about histories we've created and how important that is, we cannot ignore those aspects as well. So there are a lot of laws coming out now that are requiring LGBTQ inclusion in instruction. It's not, hasn't taken off as much as it will, but that has started. And I think that's an important part of it. We can't, Ma Rainey, thank you. Absolutely, Bessie Smith. There are so many. And so, yeah, educators, I think, have to be brave in telling those truths. And I think we also have to be brave in our conversations with our families and friends in our other circles and having those conversations. It's not easy because we know people have a lot of strongly held beliefs, but if we're going to turn the tide and be real about it and bring those fuller understandings, then those are two key spaces where those conversations have to happen.
Ms. Bell, thank you so very much for joining our Bloomfield Public Schools and educating our Bloomfield Public Schools community and an extended family. At this time, I will say to all of our participants and everyone that registered, the Learning for Justice folks are putting together 10 gift bags, goodie bag sets of materials for you guys. So I do have your email address, and if you haven't registered through the link that was given, please make sure that you do that, because that is the list that we'll be pulling folks from to see who's going to get one of these 10 free goodie bags from the Learning for Justice folks. So please make sure you go ahead and click on the link and register. And at this point, I would like to say once again, thank you guys for attending. This is our last installment of our Granddaughters of the Harlem Renaissance series, celebrating women in the month of March, as we end in a couple of days. But just because the month ends doesn't mean that the work that we're doing ends there. So we need to think about our mothers, our daughters, our sisters, our aunts, all those ladies in our lives, and how we can actually move that agenda forward. Dr. Bell, thank you very much for attending with us. And I'm forcing the doctor on you. We'll talk. Our Bloomfield community and family, thank you very much again. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.